being here. Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome Allison. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much to the Swope, to the Alliance. How's my sound okay? Doing good? Thank you, Amy, Fred, Kathy is why I'm like here. So thank you so much for making this happen too. And Lauren and Sarah, it's just awesome to see families of the Alaska family here. Wonderful supporters of our work at the museum too. I don't think the museum would be what it is without the Alaska family. So just thanks, we love it. Can we do one more? And the murals, the Alaska murals at the house will make up the bulk of this presentation, but I have worked in a few other sculptures, paintings, and other works to kind of flesh out some of the story. And we'll cap off the presentation with a deep dive into our murals. I also have to admit, we're scratching the surface today. I'm leaving out a lot of really important artwork by really important artists too. We're gonna see a couple of sculptures and paintings from the house, and I feel so sorry for the omissions that I know I am making right now too. But I am including one that was featured in the Swope's own exhibition on Debs back in 2016. I was actually at an internship out of town like that summer, so I didn't get to be around for most of that exhibition, but it was a great kind of kickoff to my work at the museum too, to get to see how important Eugene Debs is to Terre Haute and to some amazing artists who put together an amazing exhibition. So if we haven't met, I'm Allison. Can I maybe see a show of hands of who's maybe been to the house and taken my tour before? Okay, so this will be some review for a lot of you, but hopefully some new elements as well. Also in the house with us tonight is Anne Durazio, who along with her daughter and son are working on a legacy book, an art book on the murals upstairs. And this is a like picture only draft. We're working on the narrative right now, or actually Anne's family is working on the narrative. It's super exciting project. Hoping to see that finished this year, but we are going to pass around some of the photos that you can see some more details from the mural. So I would want to hold on to this the whole time if it was me, but take a few looks and then pass it around, please. We've only got the one copy. So we'll start here. This will not be a full formal overview of the life of Eugene Debs. That's what the tour is for. Would love to see all of you there, of course, but I will give a few of the broader points in the arc of Debs's life. One of the most important Hoosiers who ever lived, and I have a little bit of a bone to pick. I am from a Union family in Northeast Indiana. I'm personally a fourth generation Union member, and I know my life wouldn't have been what it has been if not for everything we see in the artwork here, but I didn't know the name until I walked by the house as a student here at ISU, my first year at band camp as a freshman. And I'm very lucky that my local friends were willing to brag on Gene to me, and I learned how important he was. But I feel like it's a crime too. I'm from Indiana, I didn't get to know this name. This is really empowering history by definition. It shows us how we can come together to make meaningful changes in our own world then and now. And I sometimes have to wonder, like, who might benefit from us not knowing how to improve our world? I don't know. I'll take off my tinfoil hat for a second. But I guess back to the murals as a quick introduction. What you're looking at here is just one of several panels in the murals. And I hope that you'll put a great big pin in that and we'll come back to it soon. Eugene Debs, besides being one of our most important Hoosiers, one of the most important labor organizers in the history of this continent, co-founded the American Railway Union, which for a while was the biggest union in the entire country, led a massive strike, the Pullman strike of 1894, shut down every major railroad from Detroit to California, to say that if it can happen to the Pullman factory workers building luxury cars they couldn't afford to ride on, then it can happen to the rest of us. 250,000 people participated in the Pullman strike that catapulted Debs into his status as a national figure too. I mean, the Pullman strike is part of why Debs became the symbol of national discontent. He was jailed for 6 months for his role leading that strike. Dozens of workers he organized were shot and killed by our own army. We're gonna see it fleshed out in the murals here. And that strike convinced Debs that both Republicans and Democrats, in his view, were in the pockets of the ruling class, bosses, landowners, you name it, not looking out for people working for a living in a meaningful way. That is why he became a socialist, co-founded the Socialist Party in Indianapolis. And I heard a little murmur, but nobody ran out the door when I said the S word, socialism. Today. All about the idea of democracy in every part of our lives, not just the ballot box every 2 or 4 years, but every day in our workplaces and our industries and our whole economy. I don't hide my views here. I already talked about my union background too. I'm also an open socialist and part of multiple socialist organizations. So talk to me about socialism if you want. I can talk about that later too. Oh, I heard a cheer. Thanks so much. But let's to move on to some more of our other highlights from our art collection at the house. We're gonna start with a couple works of sculpture that actually date back to Debs's own lifetime. This one is in our library at the Debs house, and it is a bust by Louis Meyer, who was a sculptor from Milwaukee. I don't know a whole lot about his background, but he did study in Germany, and later worked in New York. Thanks for the light, that helps too. Worked in New York and was asked to work on this bust of Debs, left New York the night he was invited to start working on it. At the time, Debs was in between sessions of his sedition trial in 1918, was facing 10 to 20 years in prison for speaking out against this country's role in World War I, which you could not do at this time. Come back to the house, we'll talk all about it, but we had some serious policies that meant that if you criticized the war effort or the US government, immigrants stripped of their citizenship and deported. People like Debs got sentences of 10 to 20 years in prison. He did it anyway, said that it was always the ruling class, the wealthy who declare wars, the working class, poor and oppressed who fight the battles, pay the prices, freely shed the blood, and furnish the corpses in wars they'd never had a say in declaring. That was enough to lock Debs up. He's indicted, arrested, convicted, sat for this bust. The trial was in Cleveland. He was allowed to leave Cleveland to go to Akron, to sit in a studio borrowed for the artist, to sit for this bust. And my read of this is that Gene's comrades and friends who were still out of prison, a lot of them were locked up, wanted to capture his likeness at what looked like Gene's last moments of freedom or before coming out of prison forever changed. He was in his 60s in failing health, had just had a heart attack. And I think at this moment, I mean, Gene's friends were already locked up for the same thing. It was no surprise what was coming the next day when he got a 10-year sentence, and Debs would not live 10 years. I cannot overstate the meaning of that moment, but even more important that Meyer was able to capture this bust. This is on the tour what I used to dig into some detail around World War I, the sedition and espionage laws, the draft, the Wilson administration. We'll dig into all that when you visit here. But one thing I really admire about this artwork, I think it's so meaningful, is that it's not any one thing. I've tried to adjust these photos to different angles of the bust to give you close to comparable views of basically different angles of the sculpture. Depending on where you stand in the room, the lighting, almost the time of day, it looks like Gene is giving you a totally, almost radically different expression. And it doesn't always come through the best in these photographs here, but the one on our left-hand side, I don't know, shout it out. What does that look like to you? Happy, sad? Sad, resigned. Okay. So like, not too happy. Not to spoil it or anything, but what do you see on the other angle? Smirk? Yeah, smirk, and that's what I lean toward as well. And I'm not saying there's any one standard official interpretation of this work, but I think what is so meaningful about it is that it captures the gray in between, that it's not just triumph, it's not just defeat. There's some real weight to this moment. You see the weariness around Gene's eyes, there's furrows in his brow, those are not so like clear here. There's real tension in his temples and his jaws and veins popping out at different points too. But there's also a head held high. There's also, I think, a gentleness about this work too. And then depending on where you are in the room, it doesn't even really come through fully, I feel like, in even this view on our right-hand side, a bit of a half smirk or an upturn. And that's when I like to ask our visitors, like, why the heck? At a moment like this, Gene, it looks like he's gonna die in prison. Why would he be shown with a smirk on his face, whether it's real or being projected onto him? But I think Gene understood that you could not lock up an idea, no one could jail a movement. That's what he said in court too, that he wasn't on trial. He thought that the American institutions that created these laws were on trial. And he thought that the verdict would be rendered by history, not in the courtroom. I think he was right about that. Generally speaking, I don't know of many people who look back fondly or approvingly on the sedition and espionage laws. They really fly in the face of what we consider a strong free speech tradition in this country and what it means in times of war and peace. And Debs had said that it's you who fight the battles, you who pay the prices, should be deciding these momentous issues of war or peace. So it's meaningful for so many reasons, but this was actually, I learned, not actually cast in bronze until the 1960s. This was the original clay model was carved in between sessions of the trial. It was cast in plaster. The artist actually gave a copy of the plaster cast to Kate Debs that she said she put her arms around and embraced every day that her husband was gone in prison. And then it was not cast in bronze until the 1960s when the artist had one made for us and one made for the National Portrait Gallery. So when you're out in the Smithsonian's various collections and you see the National Portrait Gallery, keep an eye out for Gene Debs. He has 2 busts in the collection. I don't think either of them are currently out on part of their formal displays at the time, but maybe somebody will ask, or if you ask, somebody might let you see them. I don't know. I haven't done that one yet. I haven't been to DC since my 8th grade trip, and we didn't do the Portrait Gallery, so I hope to get back soon. Gosh, there's so much to this one, but we got so much more to cover. So moving on, this is the second sculpture that we're spending a few minutes on today by Moses Viner Dykar. And I can't confirm 100%, but I'm fairly certain this one was actually carved, modeled from life in the basement of the Debs house. There are some photos of Debs with the sculpture that I couldn't track down for this presentation today, but I do have an image of the sculptor alongside another version. It was actually the original marble. We have a plaster cast in the attic of the house as well. This one is also part of the National Portrait Gallery in DC. And then here's another view of Dykar, the sculptor, in between his 2 busts of Debs and Samuel Gompers. That's an interesting topic too. Samuel Gompers was another one of the other standout labor figures of the era, but Debs and Gompers actually did not agree on a whole lot at the end of the day. They had fundamentally different ideas about how our economy works, who benefits from our labor, and had very different ideas about how to effectively organize labor unions too. But they're still 2 of the most important figures in the movement, so it's interesting, I think, to see them both side by side here. Okay, moving on. Where's our picture? It should load here. I see it on the, okay, we'll try this one. Okay, another painting for us today. This is by Elmer Kelly Modisett, and Modisett was from Terre Haute, was not a coal miner, but was a carpenter, an electrician, a letter carrier, and a disabled World War II veteran as well. And this painting is called Father and Son, oil on canvas, sits in the main bedroom of the Debs house over one of the mantles and fireplaces around the home. And for a long time, I just kind of took this painting at face value. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. Okay, they're miners, they look sad. I would be sad too, you know, if I was down in a pit like that. They're sharing a lunch, it looks like, over a pail. But then if you really think about the title, Father and Son, also, I do think the older miner bears a striking resemblance to our guy Gene, but I don't think, it might have been on purpose, I'm not really sure. But I think the weight of this painting to me looks like a father mourning the fact that his son has inherited his lot in what is supposed to be the land of opportunity. I don't know what their stories might have been, but I think it might show the limitations of maybe the promises of our system versus the reality that pans out for so many of us. There is this really, I don't know, our upper right-hand corner looks like an abyss. It's kind of hard to capture in this photograph here, but when you see it in person, it really does kind of suck you in to just that deep, dark hole that would have been a mine. And being in a mine, I mean, how can it not, I think, radicalize you in a certain sense? Seeing, and similar to, I think, COVID-19, how your employer is willing to sacrifice your own health and safety for their bottom line. And you live it every day, it's hard to not understand where your interests really are. And I think I can see why coal miners historically have been some of the most militant union members in our country's past too. So much to that. Another artwork for us today. This is a digital print by Benjamin Kite. A lot of you will know the treasurer of our foundation, the Eugene V. Debs Foundation, helps make so much of our work possible as well. This was his submission to the Juried Debs exhibition here at the school back in 2016. I'm going to read this quote for you out loud because I realize it might be hard to make out of the artwork as it is on the screen here today. But this is from Debs's sentencing hearing statement, again, upon his conviction of violating the sedition law for giving his anti-war speech. Debs had actually given a pretty profound statement. We'll see another quote from that later in the presentation that shows up in the Alaska murals. But Debs told the court about his life growing up in Terre Haute, firing the engine as a boy, on the railroads here in Terre Haute and around the state. He recalled seeing the men and women impoverished by our system and being part of the movement to alleviate this mass human suffering through the labor movement and the Socialist Party. And he went on to say that I'm opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who toil all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. I might update that a little bit to say one person who does little useful to amass a fortune of billions and billions of dollars, while billions and billions of us, regular people like us, secure barely enough for a wretched existence. Oh gosh, it's, I think, really showing us exactly what Debs built this movement on, was the idea of what we owe each other in the world too. He went on to tell the court a little bit more about his worldview, but closed that statement to the court with a really incredible symbol. I'm just gonna, I guess, use this as a chance to chat through a little bit more of what Debs covered in that speech. But it's a quote that gave us the title of one of Debs' most popular biographies, The Bending Cross. He told the court a little bit about the symbol of the Southern Cross, the constellation of stars burning luridly over the tempest-vexed sea. And as the mariner turns his eyes toward the weary horizon, or whatever he says, that as the whirling worlds change their places, and as the Almighty marks the passage of time upon the dial of the universe, the lookout knows that as the cross is bending, the cross of stars is bending, the midnight is passing, relief and rest are close at hand. That says, let the people everywhere take heart and hope, for the cross is bending, the midnight is passing, and joy cometh with the morning. Your Honor, I am prepared to receive your sentence. It gets me every single time. I have goosebumps on the skull right now, if that tells you anything. But I think my point is bringing this up and kind of complimenting Ben's artwork here with that other part of the statement, was saying that we're not just registering our protest against something that is unfair. We're showing that it really is possible to build a world that serves and suits all of our needs, not just amassing profits for the very few at the top. But all right, moving on. Another one, artist a lot of you in the room will recognize today, Rajesh Naidu, was artist in residence and visiting professor of art at Rose-Hulman a few years back, not too long ago, but a couple years now. A lot of you would have seen Rajesh working on the plein air paintings around town. I remember driving down Ohio and seeing him working outside with his easels and his paints. And one day I went to work and saw somebody set up in the green space on ISU's campus on the northeast end of the house. And oh, it's our turn, thank goodness. So Rajesh completed this incredible painting, but it's a unique angle of the house too. Usually the house is pictured from the south or west where it faces the street or the parking lot at ISU. This is from the northeast end, but I think the reason for that is that it shows the morning light on the house, which is what you see here lit up on that east wall, is illuminated. And Rajesh later did disclaim in a little bit of a statement for the piece, because to have it hanging in the foyer of the house today, that it was meaning to symbolize a little bit of Deb's optimism for a better tomorrow and a future that we can fight for together. So I'm very partial to this one in particular because I was here when we acquired it, but that is hanging up in our entryway at the house, and we'd love to have you come see that one as well. Really beautiful. And then this is us handing that off a couple years back. If you can't tell, I was super excited about that one too. Here's another newer one for us. This is from 2022 by Gigi Solige, who's actually from Fort Wayne, Indiana, near where I'm from, Northeast Indiana. She's out in LA now, but submitted this for a show in Indianapolis that was kind of themed around signage. And I haven't been, but this is how I learned about a diner or restaurant in Indianapolis called Working Man's Friend. A few of you, yeah, I see some recognition here. I've never been, sounds like a classic. The burgers online looked really, really tasty from what I could tell. Gigi had taken the logo, and I know it's really small on the slide up here, but I included a photo of the building where you can see the Pepsi logo and then Working Man's Friend. She had taken the name of the store, put it up there. You can see this is a screen print, hand pulled. And then I also kind of cracked me up a little bit how Jean's Dome becomes the Pepsi logo in a way too. but I think that's really meaningful and it's sweet. And, it's nice to put Debs in his like Hoosier working class context as well, because that's what created this guy. This is actually a very large print. It's like a huge poster. We have him at the house. She actually had donated several large prints of this, the original 10 series of 10 prints. She sent us 3 or 4 of those that we can keep. We're gonna keep one in our permanent collection, and eventually we'll do an auction or a raffle or something for those too. So nice, newer contemporary work. And now it's time to really dig into our murals. So here's a few more views of the room itself. Our attic of the house, in Jean and Kate's era, by the way, was an unfinished storage attic. Nothing that exciting, honestly, boxes and papers. If you could picture it though, Jean was a mushroom hunter. It's almost that time of year. I'm ready to get out in the woods too. He was raised to go hunting by his father, but he did not really have the heart to kill the animals, as you can imagine for a guy like Jean. He preferred foraging, collecting mushrooms, and would hang morels to dry on strings here in the attic too. Then some of you will know, in the 1950s, the house was home to Theta Chi fraternity at Indiana State, and the attic served as the guy's dorm, the cold air dorm with open windows. Not my thing, but they did it, good for them. And the murals that cover the walls now were completed in 1979. They took 3 years of work by our very own John Laska, and it's just, let me give a different picture than Larry and Bill for a second. Gosh, where do you even start with John Laska, of course? I'll give a little bit of the background and the biography that I've learned from the Laskas here. But born in New York, I think it was 1919, to Polish immigrants, and his father died from a work injury when the artist was only 5 years old, home on the couch. Became a ward of the state of New York, was in the system, drafted into World War II. Actually, I skipped a part. He was a sign painter as a teenager, like Jean Debs, which we can come back to. Drafted into World War II, sees and opens in concentration camp, changes him forever, came back to study on the GI Bill. I'd like to note for a minute, some publicly funded higher ed for a few of us at our schools in New York and Chicago, attended the Art Institute, later taught art education here at Indiana State, training our future art teachers, teaching elementary, middle school art classes, really creating a pillar of the arts community that we have here in Terre Haute today. I don't know what the city would be, honestly, without this family in particular. Laska called the murals the crowning achievement of his professional life, because I know the family is the real crowning achievement, a labor of love, and did admit that it hurt his back to work on these for 3 whole years. I can't imagine, but I'm glad he stuck it out. There's some other incredible photos of Laska working on like a special like scaffolding system with a platform that was sloped at the same angle as the walls, so as to not have to strain too much on these angled walls here. And of course, we can't not mention, this is from 2013. I guess it brings in some more artwork that's near the house. So you all know Bill Wolf, of course, and Larry Bird. Very short story about that. 2013 was the year. I was in the basketball band and got to play in the band for the statue unveiling while Larry Bird was here to say thanks for the statue by the Holman Center. And that day, it turns out Gary Daly took him on a tour of the house with Bill Walton and a photographer from the TripStar. It was Bill's idea, you could imagine, but we got a few really great photos, including this one here in the murals. Every now and then these go viral on social media, so it's nice. Our 2 great Hoosiers, I guess, and there's more than 2. I also cannot wait, because we're having such a wonderful season right now, go trees, to get Robbie Avila in here too. Yeah, it'll happen soon. But here's another one of Dr. Laska, and this one is with the Debs Award plaque. A little bit more background if you need it. The Debs Foundation presents an annual award to people and organizations working in the Debsian legacy. And every one of these honorees receives this incredible bronze cast plaque, originally designed by John Laska here. He's holding the very first one that was given to John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers of America. We have that plaque up in the second floor of the house as well. All right, here's another one. I love this portrait of Laska working. This is the first panel on the murals that you're about to see here. And actually, if you look, he's working on these Civil War soldiers and their feet that you're about to see in our very next slide. And that's actually the soldiers right here. So many of these photos are taken by Eli Morgan and son. So credit to Eli for that. Some of them are from my phone, so they're not all the best, but the ones from Eli are fabulous. And I guess I would like to walk through a few of the details here too, but also like what a feat for Alaska to have been able to accomplish this in just 3 years, especially working with very few source photographs from the earliest years of Jean's life, having to piece together with other examples of period clothing, for example. But I also love in that very top corner how they open with a passenger train. I know it's kind of small on the slide here, but it gives me a chance to talk about how Terre Haute later in Jean's life will have 100 passenger stops a day. And now we know, big fat zero. I'd love to have a few more again someday, but 80, 90 freight trains, we hear them all day at the house as well. And the little house that you see up in the corner there was the little house on 4th Street where Jean was born in 1855. There is a small limestone marker. It's really just a pillar over on 4th Street by ISU's arena building showing where that little birthplace house used to stand. There's just a small plaque. Actually, I'll tell you the story. This is before me, but if you remember the Louis Meyer bust, the first artwork that we opened up this presentation with, another casting of that bust was actually placed on top of that pillar marking the birthplace on ISU's campus. I guess this is back in the 70s. And I don't know all the details. We have a few newspaper clippings from this era, but that bust disappeared from the pillar. Anybody remember this? I don't know. Yeah, a couple of us. There you go. The foundation put out a notice offering a reward for the sculpture's safe return and a fraternity magically founded by a railroad track somewhere in town. So I want to bring it up just to tie it back into the birthplace that we see here, but also noting that these are Civil War soldiers. Jean Debs being born in 1855 meant that he was old enough to recall Union soldiers getting back to Terre Haute at the end of the Civil War, wounded or dead. Now, on the one hand, maybe more surface level, how that might shape someone who's later going to be an anti-war figure. But I want to be clear here, Debs also idolized John Brown. I don't even know who we're talking about here. It was not a Paul, it was hopefully a good reaction to that, I don't know. But there's a lot to this, basically. It's not that Debs ever wanted to see another civil war to change our economic system, but he also saw what it took in his own lifetime to end the racist, exploitative, economic, extractive system of chattel slavery. And decades down the road, Debs asked out loud, who will be the John Brown of wage slavery? That was on purpose. He's being provocative here because he wanted white wage workers to see themselves as having much more in common than different with formerly enslaved Black Americans. Otherwise, we're never going to build a better world if we can't do it together. All right, eulogized the guy over and over and visited Harper's Ferry, which I plan to get to someday as well. Anyway, Jean was still a boy here. I'll just walk through a few more of the details. There's those oval cameo portraits of Jean's parents, Daniel and Daisy Debs, who were French immigrants from Colmar, Alsace, came over when Alsace was still France in the late 1840s, lived in Brooklyn, Cincinnati, Terre Haute, back to New York, back to Terre Haute, ran a small grocery store out of their home. Daniel Debs was able to find work in Terre Haute before they opened the store, laying railroad track and processing pork. These are the kind of jobs that are your 16-hour days, 6 days a week. Your boss is a stranger instead of your family, which was the case for Daniel back in France. And he was, his health was broken by his job processing pork by the river. He was either sick or hurt for a period, couldn't work. Daisy had 2 daughters that had survived, 2 daughters that did not. She was on her 5th pregnancy, was going to be Jean Debs when her breadwinner could no longer win the bread, 7 months pregnant. So she put together the last of their savings, bought some dry goods from the Holman Company that she used to open her own grocery store out of that house on 4th Street. It was a 4-room house, family of 4 or 5 and growing, giving up their living space to run that shop. I can't wrap my head around the sacrifice, and they were the lucky ones, to be clear. You know, not every corner shop like that was gonna make it, but by the time Jean was 5 years old, they were able to move to 11th and Main Street. Other immigrants had supported the shop. 11th and Main, exactly where Jimmy John's is, a few blocks that away. A lot of you know, I used to drive delivery for that Jimmy John's for a little bit of time. I delivered some of your sandwiches before, and a lot of opinions about workers' rights and food service too. Also, since we're talking about art, we can talk about some of like our literary or philosophical influences too. Those 3 kind of sepia tone portraits right in the middle here, and I also love how the artist is using different color schemes to give you different, I don't know, connotations with different parts of the murals. But those 3 faces in the middle, the first one is Victor Hugo. Daniel and Daisy raised their children on a healthy diet of Victor Hugo and Voltaire. Victor Hugo, you will know best, and I've got to stop saying Hugo with a Y, it's Hugo with an H, sorry. Best known for Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, sorry for my French today, 2 short books. about the outcasts, the discarded, there's so much that you can do with that, but Gene's favorite book was Les Mis as a kid. He said he read it over and over in French. I'm still working on the English audiobook, so I don't know how he did it. But if you know the story of Jean Valjean, who steals a loaf of bread and goes to prison for 19 years, and that's just the exposition of the novel, not hard to see how that might shape Gene's Debs sense of what we owe each other in this world in his formative years. Also, Eugene V. Debs, the V stands for Victor. He's named after Victor Hugo. It's a lovely connection. Then Voltaire. Nobody's named after Voltaire in this family, but liberty, brotherhood, equality is the foundation for Gene in his worldview. The last space in the middle there is one Thomas Paine, who I'm glad gets a bit of a shout out in the murals too. Debs edited a socialist paper called The Appeal to Reason, which was a direct reference to the writings of Thomas Paine. A lot of ink has been spilled, to be frank with you, about how much Debs is shaped by Paine, Lincoln, Jefferson, Washington. Some biographers insist more than Marx and Engels, but I'm going to say that it is all of the above. And that is exactly what makes Debs so remarkable, was that he took these European ideas and helped them make sense in the American lowercase d democratic tradition. We don't have kings and queens here, but look at that landed aristocracy that none of us got to vote for. What is more American, if you will, than fighting for a say, not just at the ballot box, but every day in our workplaces and in our industries? That's why Debs is often described as a uniquely American socialist, but I don't think it's uniquely American to fight against oppression wherever we see it too. All right, so he's still a kid. I can't get ahead of myself. You also see Gene here kind of in his classroom setting, and he was a very good student. He attended the old seminary school and then the public school in Terre Haute, the high school, which gets better funding after the Civil War, the whole thing there. And he was a promising student, probably was going to follow in his father's footsteps to run this business, and against his parents' wishes, dropped out of school when he was just 14. And Gene really did care about education as well, but he was the eldest son in a family with 5 children, 4 sisters and a younger brother. And I still think Gene felt a sense of obligation or duty to find a way to support the rest of his family, even if the family shop was pretty stable. And I also appreciate how he's kind of beckoned by the steam engine here. And if you were able to see it up close and personal, you will, up on that engine in the cab, and it was just some visitors that pointed this out to me recently. I could have missed it for a long time. But there is just like a pencil outline of an engineer and a fireman in the cab, but they're not filled in, they're not painted fully. And did we notice these before? Like, yeah, I missed it for a long time, honestly. I noticed new details almost every time. But I think that's Gene being able to imagine himself filling those roles someday, actually sooner than later. And he did drop out, 14 years old. First was a painter for the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad, painting train cars with lead paint, scraping the paint off when it peeled and flicked away. We banned the lead paint a century later, but you bet we still have child labor in Indiana, and I would argue it's getting worse. But after about a year, Gene moved up to work as a locomotive fireman, one of the worst jobs on trains. I'm starting to think about steam engines like bombs on wheels, basically. I have a little bit of a minor phobia about anything under pressure, like a home canner or even my tires. In the case of like a steam engine, it took me a long time to figure this out because we're just not taught about a lot of the mechanics of it. But that big front part of the engine is a boiler, right? And if there's no rule about how often somebody needs to check the water level in the boiler, and you've been working 14, 16-hour days, there's no such thing as a rule like for how often you're supposed to check that. And what happens when the water runs dry in the boiler? You're done. You're probably not surviving an explosion like that. And OSHA is still a century away. Most workers don't have a union to bargain for better conditions. There's no such thing as employer liability that you can probably enforce in court. You have to accept that risk and hope that your widow can remarry before your kids start. That's your insurance, basically, okay? And they were the lucky ones, to be clear. Like, there's so much to this, but it's after Gene himself saw at least one death of a fellow worker. He said he saw someone firsthand crushed under the wheels of a vacuum locomotive. You might think he's going to organize, but first he quit. He was a billing clerk for the Holman Company for a while, but he knew his fellow workers wouldn't all have that choice. He joined his first union when he was just 19. It was to help organize the Vigo County Lodge of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, just a 2-year-old union that existed to pay for the members' funerals. All right, that's how bad the work was. Everybody paid 50 cents and a month in dues, and if you didn't make it home from work on a given day, your widow could expect a check from your union secretary to pay for your wages, some lost wages and your funeral. not a lifetime of wages. It's no such thing as social security. There's no safety net from your government. Your boss is not on the hook. That cash, which is real cash, was gonna come from your fellow workers, maybe struggling just as much. So a glimpse into how dire the priorities really had to be. But we'll get to this, I guess. There's so much that we can follow with Debs's progression in the labor movement, but there's another piece of Terre Haute history I don't want to skip here. How many of you knew, maybe from us, that Susan B. Anthony spoke in this town? Yeah, a few hands, very good. How many of you learned that from the museum? A couple of us, okay, I'll take it. So she did, it's in 1879. Debs, as a national officer of his union at this point, was also becoming a bit of a civic figure in Terre Haute, ran a debate club in this town, the Occidental Society. It's not my favorite name, but that's okay. Brought in sometimes controversial speakers who otherwise might not have an invitation to talk in a town like this. Some of those would include Robert Ingersoll, the agnostic Republican from Illinois, Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist lecturer. But Debs thought, let's invite Susan B. Anthony. The story, as he tells it, was that she was so controversial that the debate club refused to sponsor her lecture, so he invited her anyway, but had to rent the hall with his own money so she'd have a venue to speak in. He said that she was pelted with insults the minute she got off the train, and Gene later reflected on this as one of the first times that he intimately saw that level of prejudice of that kind in his hometown. Never forgot about it. And I want to draw the connection that every time Debs ran for president, decades down the road, was running on planks to grow and strengthen our voting rights beyond anything Susan B. Anthony was talking about, by the way. He was talking about abolishing poll taxes and literacy tests, to be clear, and that's back in the 19-teens. All right, moving on a little bit. Let's jump ahead to the Pullman strike. I'm not going to do the whole blow by blow about the Pullman strike, but the murals give us like the best opportunity in the House to explore one of the biggest work stoppages in this country's history. And come to the House for the whole spiel, I guess, but if you could imagine something like the Pullman strike happening today, which is also what I really try to focus on in the House, is not just why is this interesting, but why does it matter? Why is it still relevant to our lives in some way, even if the world isn't exactly the same now as it was then? But what if you woke up tomorrow and you couldn't find an open restaurant east of St. Louis? You couldn't find a cup of coffee east of St. Louis. Everybody who works in food service is out on strike, not for their own gain, not for their own check or their own contract, but maybe to demand justice for the Memphis 7, the Starbucks organizers in Memphis who were illegally fired for trying to organize last year. The NLRB said they got their jobs back, but these kinds of firings, illegal firings, still happen all the time. What I'm trying to say here is that in the Pullman strike and in this hypothetical situation here, the 250,000 workers who walked off the job and shut down the railroads were not even striking for their own gain. They were striking to say that if it can happen in Pullman, it can happen to us. That is a secondary strike, and they are almost entirely illegal today. I would argue because they are so effective at disrupting business as usual. Yeah, we can go on and on about that. But Grover Cleveland is shown next to George Pullman up here. I think the artist was doing something on purpose. There's I think it's Gramsci who talked about the unity of the ruling class, and am I right about that? Basically, government and employers, the argument here, can team up, in this case, to break worker organizing whenever it stands a chance of actually challenging power and changing things. In this case, shutting down the railroads looked like these workers were going to demand meaningful change, but Grover Cleveland gave the green light to send in the United States Army to break the strike. And I have to stop saying break the strike. It's a euphemism. They were shooting into crowds of unarmed strikers who refused to clear the tracks and let strike breakers move the trains. It was the end of this union, like formally, de facto, I guess, end of the American Railway Union. All of the union officers, including Debs, got jail time for breaking a court order meant to stop the strike. Dozens of workers were shot and killed by our own army. And you get that out of passive voice. Our own army shot and killed dozens of workers, okay? Dozens more hurt, hundreds arrested, thousands blacklisted, would never work on trains again. Debs and all the AAU officers I mentioned got jail time, and we got Labor Day. Like, and I'm not even kidding, like Grover Cleveland signed the legislation establishing a federal holiday for Labor Day into law during the strike. Not even a sorry, we're shooting you on the tracks, have a day off and a picnic, not a strike, a parade, not a protest, and forget about May 1st, which we can talk about later. But now Debs is in jail, has to rethink a lot of things. Up until this point, couldn't stand the socialists. He's represented by Clarence Darrow, by the way. Let me talk about that for a second. Clarence Darrow, you might consider one of the greatest attorneys in American history, ruined his career as a railroad lawyer to take on Debs's case during the Pullman strike, actually. Before Pullman, Darrow was a well-paid railroad lawyer who took the Debs's case, represented the ARU. It ended up going before the Supreme Court. The issue was the use of the injunction, a court order used to stop the strike, in which like one judge or a couple lawyers basically can rule a strike illegal for all kinds of different reasons. But that means that if you are caught participating in that strike or affiliated with the union putting on the strike, you can be locked up. If it's a civil case, you don't have a jury trial. It's going to set the pattern for breaking strikes for decades to come. And is part of the chaos that led, I think, to the labor peace that came out of the New Deal. Anyway, spokes on a wheel, I think, come back to Debs, and Clarence Darrow was a key piece of that. Darrow, as you know, become, after his time as a labor lawyer, more involved in other civil liberties issues, and maybe most well remembered by my generation for defending the teaching of evolution in schools in the so-called Scopes monkey trial. Which also involves another overlapping character, William Jennings Bryan, who Debs actually campaigned for one time, but then they ran against each other twice. But it was Darrow versus Bryan. We'll save that for later. Fast forward a little bit, Debs has co-founded the Socialist Party, run for president 5 times. I didn't include the correct panel here to show you the 2 decades that Debs spent growing and building a socialist movement, running for president 5 times on the idea of economic democracy, being able to decide collectively, democratically, who benefits from our labor, what our labor will look like, and building our labor around use and need instead of for profit. He goes on to speak out against the Great War and all war but class war. He's arrested and convicted. This is a scene from his sentencing hearing. And I realize now I put these 2 slides back to back because it's the 2 courtroom scenes that really kind of bookend almost Gene's like radical political life in a way. He didn't like have an overnight conversion to socialism after the strike. It took him several years actually, but I just think it's stunning that we have these 2 courtroom scenes in front of a bench, just a few feet apart in these murals, but that represents the difference of about 2.5 decades. Anyway, Debs told the court, Your Honor, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings and made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest or lowest on earth. I said then, and I say now, you can read it with me if you want, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And that is the Debs credo. That I'm so grateful it's in the murals because it means I have to remember to include it on every single tour. There's so much to include that the bigger challenge is deciding what to leave out, honestly, but you can't leave out the credo, and especially since it's so visually prominent up on the 3rd floor. And I think it really shows us what solidarity meant to Eugene Debs, how he lived it, how far he extended the idea of solidarity to those most discarded and abused by our bigger society. And I think how Debs really lived that value, not just in his words, but his actions and the movements he was a part of, never acting just as an individual, even if he was remembered as a singular individual. We wouldn't get to talk about him today in this museum, over at our house, if it weren't for the bigger collective effort that Debs was just one key part of. So the judge was not moved, gave Debs a 10-year sentence. And one of my other, I think, most moving parts of the murals, you're kind of in an alcove area, and I don't have all the photos from it. It's the alcove from the very first slide I had up here. So it's a very enclosed space, and honestly not much smaller than the cell that Gene shared in the Atlanta prison with 5 other men. They were all different nationalities, but Gene said that he was an internationalist, so they got along swimmingly. But anyway, it's also in prison where Debs almost lost his faith in the possibility of building a better world. His party fell apart into splinters and factions that you might argue never really recovered his relevance because you might argue was not able to act as the unifying figure that he had been for 2 decades. It didn't matter what kind of socialist you were, you could vote for Debs when it came to that election every 4 years. But I think what the artist did here, Debs would be basically opposite what we're looking at right now, but he is mirrored exactly by Sacco and Vanzetti and Joe Hill. That's the 3 faces that you see in the corner here. I wish I had an hour for each of these men, but they were all immigrant anarchist organizers who were all executed on murder convictions that would not have held up in court today in the states of Massachusetts for Sacco and Vanzetti and Utah for Joe Hill. Joe Hill's one of mine and the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. all executed, I would argue, for being radical organizers and meaningfully challenging power as part of this movement. And then next to them, you have scenes from Haymarket, Chicago, and Ludlow, Colorado. Men, women, and children shot, hanged, and burned alive, fighting for the 8-hour day, which who even has anymore? You tell me, I don't know. But I think what the artist is doing is showing that Eugene Debs was no one-off person. The Pullman strike was not a one-off event either, neither was Debs going to prison. That these are pieces of a puzzle that fit together, and I think help us understand the challenges that working people still face today in a long, long fight for a better world. Now, there's several panels that make up a legacy, and they're especially in the, where's our book? It's about halfway through. So that kind of visualize a legacy. Debsians working in this tradition of the last, I guess it's 150 years, but this panel is one of my favorites in the murals too. I'd like to walk us through who we've got here. It starts with Karl Marx, who profoundly inspired Debs. He read Capital in his jail cell after the Pullman strike, and Debs said it set the wires humming in the system. Then you have Debs himself, and then Norman Thomas with the white hair, Debs' successor in the Socialist Party, ran president another half a dozen times. Next is W.E.B. Du Bois, Pan-Africanist, sociologist, voted for Debs 1912, standout. I wish he could have gotten a Debs award like most of these on the panel here. Next up is Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement, then A. Philip Randolph, who did what Debs' American Railway Union would not, to organize the Black Pullman porters in their own union, one of the most important of the last century. A. Philip Randolph, a pillar of the civil rights movement, credited as the architect of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King gave the I Have a Dream speech. A march that was sponsored by that next guy's union. The last one there is Walter Reuther of United Auto Workers. My mom is UAW, so I have a lot of feelings about this part here. But when you look at the pamphlets or buttons from the March on Washington 68, they say sponsored by UAWCIO because it is the March for Jobs and Freedom. Let us unite our causes for economic and civil rights, because you can't have one without the other. I think it's King who says, what good is sitting at the lunch counter if you cannot afford the meal being served? You need a full economic foundation through secure jobs, housing, education, in order to have full participation as equals in any democracy. So I just really appreciate that these two are shown side by side here. And, you know, I used to wrap up the murals by asking a little hypothetical, like who might someone imagine adding to the end of this lineup here? And there's a million different answers we could give, but I stopped asking that for two reasons. One is that it is still actually Walter Reuther's union, not just because I care about it, but still that union leading some of the most significant strikes in recent history, not just the big three, not just John Deere, but the University of California graduate students too, led the biggest strike. There's over 100,000 of them now. And it's the future of the movement. We all, no matter what kind of job you do, I think deserve a fair contract that you get to have a say in negotiating. And the grad students in California are showing us that. But Debs also spelled it out, that so long the working class, he said, would wait for a mythical Moses to lead us out of bondage to the promised land. Gene said if he could lead us, let's just skip it, because somebody else is just going to lead us back to Egypt. We have to get ourselves to a better world together, using our heads, using our hands, like that, and organizing, finding our spot in this long fight for a better world. I love this part of the mural too, because I'm sure a lot of you have seen the mural by Don Laska at the Unitarian Universalist Church out on Fruit Ridge. I have been told that Laska used congregation members as hand models for both of these murals. There is a Seinfeld joke in there somewhere. Somebody remembers, but I also just think it's so meaningful that we have so many Terre Hautians represented in these murals. The artist's family, friends, fellow workers that all make up the models here, whether they're real people or just figures for the murals. But one of the last panels that we see in the murals is also just a few more. I go from don't wait for a leader to look at a couple more leaders today. But in the middle, in the coal miner's hat with the lamp, is John L. Lewis with the best eyebrows in labor history, of course, and true to life. Cesar Chavez with one of the peace signs here. But in the bottom left corner, and Sarah told me this, otherwise, I don't know that I would have put it together. That is your artist, John Laska. We're used to seeing him in glasses, right? All the photos that I've seen, here he doesn't have them, but I'm so glad he was able to sneak himself in, and that Sarah made sure that I knew about this as well. And I don't have the dedication pulled up on the screen here, but I'd like to show, you know, what this space really means to us now. Laska wrote at the end of the murals, really at the beginning, that the paintings were made in gratitude to the memory of Eugene Debs and all men and women who, in the Debs' tradition, strive for peace, economic and social justice for all of humankind, Alaska 79. So I hope that shows that the murals are not just for Jean, but they're for really everybody in this room and in these photos, and everyone who has a part in keeping the story and the fight alive. And it's just so like touching to be able to wrap it up with these 4 photos here. Upper left is a group of union apprentices. We have tours that come through from the operators, the electricians, the plumbers and steam fitters, taking their labor history class as a part of their paid apprenticeship with the union. And we always take a quick tour of the house, not too quick, actually, it's a very long tour. We have a really nice time and then take a photo at the end. But the murals always make a lovely backdrop for these group or smaller photos. You saw Larry Bird and Bill Walton in the same spot earlier. So that's the upper left. Upper right is Lisa Phillips, actually, one of my professors and mentors at Indiana State who helped me get into the house in the first place. But this is several years back. She was giving a lecture and a film presentation for one of her classes up in the murals. We have used the attic for other programs like this, but we have moved toward having a lot of our programs on the lower floors of the house for more accessibility. The bottom left photo is a union training. This was a Teamsters division. It was the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way employees who maintain the railroad tracks, basically. And they were working on an internal organizing campaign several years ago. They came out to Terre Haute to have their training here at the house and just surrounded by the murals, learning about skills and tools to make their own union more effective and representative too. It was fabulous. And then that last photo are some med students from IU, actually IU Indy, who came out last summer on a service learning trip to Terre Haute and to learn about, your social predictors of health or whatever. And we had a long, fabulous tour of the house as well, but that's that really happy group at the very end here. And if you want to see your family or your organization up here in a similar photo like that, let us know. This is a free museum. We're open 5 days a week, 12 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday, but we can do stuff by appointment or after. We have programs and all kinds of events all year long. Anne, who's in the crowd with us today, has put together a fabulous, actually 2 film series, but one for March on Women's History. And we have films at Tyree Hall at ISU happening every Saturday for the rest of the month, starting tomorrow at 10 if you want to come out. But yeah, sorry, not a good ending here, but I hope that you have enjoyed my quick run through of some of our art offerings at the house. We've only scratched the surface. There's so much more. I believe past my time too. Are we still okay for questions and whatnot?
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Wyatt. Yeah. Any discussion points or questions about anything that we've covered? Yeah.
I really don't have a question for you, but I have a statement for the audience. This is the kind of interesting speaker that we have at the Alliance meeting. Through May, on the 3rd Friday at noon, we have a lecture. Allison was supposed to do the January meeting and couldn't. Well, let me go back to the schedule. We don't meet in December because the calendar comes too close to a lot of religious holidays, including Christmas. So, but September through May, excluding December, come sometime at noon and enjoy more of this. Okay, thank you.
There are so many paintings of faces. I remember at some point there was a discussion about identifying. Have you managed to identify most of the faces, or are there still a lot of unknowns?
It's better than it was when we last talked about this, I think. So we've been able to flesh out a little bit. Also, figuring out who's based on real life, models, family members. We've been able to piece together a few more of those with Alaska Family's assistance. We've had some visitors who came through who said that they were students under Alaska who had to pose as models as part of their class credit too. So we have a couple photos of those side by sides. Trying to think. Yeah, it's never I don't know if it'll ever be 100%, but we're fleshing it out bit by bit as we go. So come back in and we'll show you where we're at right now with that. There's just so many faces in that mural too. We've only scratched the surface. What else? Anything else to chat about?
Yeah, I have taken the tour, and I will say you are a tremendous tour guide, and and you have just scratched the surface here. I always wondered, one of the things that impresses me about the organization of the mural is just, it's a crazy space, this attic space with all these triangular, panels, and but he's organized that in such a way that every plane of the attic kind of becomes an episode.
Yeah.
Right, do you know anything about his preparation process? How, how much, for, planning? was involved?
Yeah, it looks like he had to piece it together as he went, from what I can tell. It's hard to know for sure, but we can kind of do what feels like archaeology to try to put it back together. We have a bunch of his charcoal and pencil sketches too. So what looks like the process was, to begin with, was drawing on one side of some semi-transparent paper, the pencil outline of what he's gonna end up having up here. And I've seen different panels that are bigger and smaller versions of the same thing. So it looks like he's working through the scale of these details as he's going. But then looks like flips it over, puts it on a whiteboard, traces his pencil marks in charcoal, and then applies those to the wall, and then traces the pencil side again with another pencil or whatever to push that charcoal onto the wall to make his outline. These are acrylic murals too. So there's also, you can see where it looks like he does one and then maybe shifts it a little bit, or there's even what look like pencil marks still alongside the acrylic paint on the wall too. And it can't be an accident. I think it really had to be on purpose to show this is not a finished story either. I also get these different interpretations from people like Anne and Amy, who come in frequently and make sure that I'm getting different points of view on this as well, because I feel differently about it from day to day. But it really does look like a living, moving work of art too. And I think that's a big piece of it, is how much thought went into that layout to make it so episodic like you're talking about here. Good question there. Hope that fills in some of that too. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Kathy.
Think you'll ever get an elevator?
We were quoted $200,000. So, but we want to someday, there's money out there to do stuff like this, and I don't think Gene would care if there's an elevator on the outside of his house, honestly. It's one of those would be nices right now. We're also working on $1 million restoration. A lot of you heard me talk about this before. We have roofers coming any day now. Very excited for that. It's been that way for a while, but we're also especially prioritizing getting accessibility to our first floor. We still have a ramp, but that's kind of first order of business for our accessibility, and then elevators so we can all get up to the third floor too. Thanks, Kathy. All right, well, thank you all so very much.